think I can go ahead then and start the proceedings. Hi, I'm Kate Cooper, one of the conveners for the seminar, and I will be chairing today for our presentation from Albrecht Diem, who is someone who is, I know, known to many of you from Leeds and from Vienna and from Utrecht, and indeed from lots of other places. And we're very, we're really benefiting from the world of Zoom in that Albrecht, who is, I think, is institutionally, and I believe also physically, in upstate New York at the moment, is actually with us here. So thank you, Albrecht, so much for joining us. And most of you, I think, will already know Albrecht's work on early medieval monasticism. A couple of things to mention. He's got a new book out, The Pursuit of Salvation, Community, Space, and Discipline in Early Medieval Monasticism, with a critical edition and translation of the Regula Cuiusdam ad Virgines. So, get your copy from Brepols, and of course, order it for your library. And he's been a director of one of the Visions of Community projects in Vienna, and runs a website that some of you may know on early medieval monasticism as well. So I'm going to hand over to Albrecht, but before I do, I just want to mention one or two, house protocols about how we run things. So generally, the paper itself will go until something like 20 past the hour, so 50-ish minutes, give or take. And then we'll hand over to discussion at that one. Our system for discussion is known to many of you. It's focused around the chat. So we ask that you resist your desire to break in or to use your yellow hand or anything like that. And instead, if you either put into the chat the word question, or indeed, you can write your whole question out if you prefer, which is obviously helpful if you have bandwidth issues or you're, zooming in from a library or something. If you feel moved to ask a question during the seminar, this is in principle allowed, but please put it in a private message to Alice Rio, and because she'll be sort of curating, the chat during the call. And so she'll kind of collect things. And then once we actually have the discussion going, we'll try to work in a Benedictine order where people's questions are brought in the order of that they entered the list, as it were. If you're just dying to throw in a specific, short idea, you can put it into the chat, and the chair, which is me, will quickly say, just, newsflash, somebody's mentioned X, and, but generally speaking, we'll try to be Benedictine and just follow the order in which the question was entered into the queue, as it were. So with that, finally, we encourage people, for reasons of bandwidth, etc., to turn off your sound and stop your video during the talk. Once the talk is over, if you're able to turn your video on, that's nice, because it creates more of an atmosphere for Albrecht, who will get to see that we're not just ghostly names on a little black square. So with that, I'll hand over to Albrecht. Albrecht, thank you so much for joining us, and we're really looking forward to listening to you. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kate, for this very kind introduction, and for the invitation to speak to this wonderful crowd. One small thing about the book that Kate just mentioned. I published it open access, so you still can encourage your library to buy the physical book, which would be great, but you can also just download it and read it as a PDF file. So I hope that this is part of democratizing knowledge. One image that comes to my mind when thinking about the perceived history of early medieval monasticism is that of a large steamship sailing slowly and steadily through history. If the terrifying Germanic Großkirche is something like Cunard's Queen Mary, monasticism would be kind of the Queen Elizabeth. The ship starts in the Nile Valley in Upper Egypt, cruises through the Mediterranean with stops in Syria, in Gaza, and Constantinople, organized day trips to Rome and Monte Cassino, stops at Marseille and the island monastery of Lerins, travels up and down the Rhone Valley, and even embarks on a detour to Ireland, England, and Frisia. On the way, it loads and unloads people, cargo, books, but the ship remains basically the same. The history of this slow enclosed steamship is uneventful and pleasantly boring. It is relevant preliminary for steamship aficionados and comfortable for everyone else because it assumes a stable entity and an element of continuity in the otherwise troubled waters of the transformation of the Roman world. Monasticism sails, as it seems, through history without having much of a history itself, aside from the above-mentioned stopovers. A monk is a monk, a monasterium is a monasterium, a regula, and from early onwards, a stable fixture of monastic life. And female monasticism is just a gender-adjusted variant to the male model. For quite a while now, historians tried to sink this metaphor and to create a new, much more complicated and less boring narrative of monastic history, a history of monasticisms, diversity, experimentation, and a history that should not be approached from the vantage point of its outcome, medieval or even worse, Benedictine monasticism as we think of it. In this new approach, we see how the ever-changing setting of the late and post-Roman worlds, how in this setting groups of people experimented with creating ideal forms of communal Christian life and institutions that would have a chance to last. The period of late antiquity and the earlier Middle Ages produced or invented a huge variety of forms of communal religious life. Aristocratic villas turned into monasteries, communities serving a natural shrine, monasteries built and endowed by members of the political and ecclesiastical elites, communities gathered around the charismatic holy man, fine retreats of monastic otium, settled in a city or on an island or in a real or perceived wilderness, and everything in between. And each of these different monasticisms could eventually take any kind of shape. It is a process of constantly reinventing itself based on an accumulating body of texts and experience. A wonderful summa. Now I hope that the PowerPoint presentation does not leave me. A wonderful summa of this attempt to write a history beyond the steamship narrative is the recently published Cambridge History of Medieval Monasticism in the West. There is a stumbling block for this endeavor to historicize and diversify the history of communal religious life. First, it is this accumulating body of texts, hagiographic texts, monastic rules, ascetic treatises, sermons, acts of councils. Almost all of these sources make explicit or implicit claims about the past, and usually it's either a past that it's not much different from the present, or a past that represents a world to be emulated or returned to. Hardly any of our sources admits that their monastic world is the product of developments, fundamental transformations, and arguments. Few of them admit that there is a legitimate diversity of monasticisms. If they're a form of monastic life other than their own, they are dangerous deviations to be ignored or vigorously rejected. So if we want to give monasticism a history, we need to read our sources against the grain and force them to tell a history they don't want to tell. I have two examples of the deceiving power of our sources. One is Benedict of Aniana's Codex Regularum, a collection of monastic rules preserved in only one manuscript from the early 9th century. This collection that was put together as part of the effort to unify monastic life under the Regula Benedicti played a key role in establishing the notion of monastic life as a vita regularis. Monks lived according to regulae from almost the beginnings. The regulae may have changed, albeit that they actually look very much the same, but the principle of vita regularis did not. Another example would be the Vitae Patrum collections that reach back to the 9th century as well. With some variations, they usually contain the Latin translations of the Vita Antonii, the saints' lives of Jerome, the monastic historiae, the Verba Seniorum, and a couple of other lives of desert fathers. They teach us powerfully about the perceived origins of monastic life in the Egyptian desert, about the first hermit and the first cenobite, and they evoke a world to be admired and emulated. Monastic historians, at least those who are no steamship aficionados, have left this history behind, though it's still very much alive and well in some textbooks and powerful in historiographic surveys that treat monasticism in the margins. But what we don't have yet is an attempt to create a new narrative that is not structured along the anchor points of the steamship. I won't be able to present one today, so I would like to suggest some interrelated turning points or silent transformations that could structure such a narrative and that are not visible if we read our sources the way they want us to be read. One of these instances of transformation, maybe the most important one, is when the monastic foundation by outsiders who had no inclination to embrace monastic lives themselves turned into the prevalent model of establishing a monastic community. So when do spontaneously arising and often short-living communities around a charismatic founding figure phase out, and founding, building, and sustaining monasteries and their communities become part of the repertoire of piety of Roman and post-Roman secular and ecclesiastical elites? Peter Brown did groundbreaking work on this question, but there's still much more to do. Another transformation: when and to what extent did the monastery turn from a community that may have settled on a space into a space inhabited by a community? At some point, a locus sanctus, determined and empowered by its boundaries. When did monasteries and their surroundings begin to understand the increasingly standardized prayer as an act of intercession for themselves, but also for the outside world? And when did this intercessory prayer become political and a factor of political stability? When did monasteries indeed begin to build their identity, their practice, and their discipline around regulae and define the monastic life as vita regularis? Then there's the transformation that turned monasteries into places of teaching and the preservation of knowledge, and eventually into islands of literacy. Another turning point would be the transition from competitive asceticism to a life shared, of shared, equal, and moderate monastic discipline, from desert to desert. And then there's the long shadow of Augustine's doctrine of predestination and dependence on divine grace that denies individuals and communities to become agents on behalf of their salvation. Is it possible to integrate the attempts to escape this long shadow into a new monastic narrative? Somehow related to this question, how, when, and whether monastic communities started to understand and present themselves as holy community, carrying on the same power an undoubtedly holy individual had. And that's the transformation I want to focus on today. For much of what I described, the 6th century seems to be the decisive period, which is annoying given the fact that this is the period when the stream of late antique literary production came to run dry, and new repositories and textual forms have not established yet. So a lot can be seen only by comparing the before with the after. But there's some material, some hagiographic texts, and especially a handful of monastic rules to work with. And that's what I want to do after this rather long-winded introduction. I want to talk about 4 monastic rules: Caesarius of Arles, Regula ad Virgines, the rule of Aurelian, the successor of Caesarius, the Regula Tanantensis, and the Regula Ferioli, and then about 2 eminent 6th century hagiographic texts, the Vita Abbatum Acanensium and the Vita Patrum Jurensium. I want to ask these texts how they conceptualize a monastic community as a holy community, or to put it slightly differently, a community that has agency with regards to the salvation of its members, and maybe even those who found, sustain, and protect these monasteries. Parts of this endeavor are not entirely new, and you may have come across some of the ideas in the work I've already published, especially in the book. The core, however, is fairly fresh and based on a new edition and translation of the 6th century monastic rules produced after Caesarius of Arles, on which I and my husband Mathieu are currently working on. The result is simple and, to my taste, still exciting. First, this was indeed a matter of concern, a new topic to be addressed. Second, there was at this point no established discourse of collective self-sanctification. Our sources produced in a highly creative way very different answers. So we can see a little bit of these processes of monasticism inventing itself and producing a repertoire of discourses that could later develop a life of their own. The most important monastic rule written in 6th century Gaul is Caesarius of Arles, Regula ad Virgines, which he wrote and revised probably in collaboration with his sister and niece, the 2 Caesarias, over a period of almost 30 years. The text was written for a community of nuns he founded together with his sister and moved into the city walls of Arles. It was the first monastic community, monastic rule specifically written for a female community. In 534, he had its final version confirmed with the signature of 6 of his fellow bishops. This is unique for a monastic rule and shows both its importance and Caesarius' desire to legitimate the textual basis of his monastic experiment. There were some good reasons for Caesarius' nervousness. Both his foundation and the program he developed for it were new and probably controversial. It meant 2 things: submitting the Virgines Sacratae of his diocese to a monastic regime that was inspired by his own monastic background as a former monk of the monastery of Les Reims. And secondly, he tried to create with his nuns as guinea pigs, as it were, a new concept of monastic life that would, despite the full dependence on divine grace, give his nuns the security of reaching eternal salvation and even the power to perform intercessory prayer for him as a founder, but also for the entire Christian community at large. So Caesarius' experiment can be related to quite a number of those turning points I listed in the introduction of my lecture, and his Regula ad Virgines had a deep impact both on female and male monastic life. One of the key ideas of Caesarius' Regula ad Virgines was that of total enclosure. Whoever wanted to become a member of the community was not allowed to leave the monastic building for the rest of their lives. So he writes, "These things befit your holy souls. If a girl, leaving her parents, desires to renounce the world and enter the holy fold to escape the jaws of the spiritual wolves by the help of God, she must never, up to the time of her death, go out of the monastery nor into the basilica where there is a door." A good part of the provisions of the Regula ad Virgines elaborates on this total enclosure, reinforces it, and closely controls the interactions between the nuns and the outside world. The imperative of total enclosure forms the beginning of the rule, appears at the end of its first revision, and is reinforced in the last set of chapters, which he calls Recapitulatio, and it's also repeated at the end. So it's enclosure, it's a sort of the rule is enclosed by provisions on total enclosure. This total enclosure, which is also mentioned in the Vita Caesari and in some other texts, is as the trademark of Caesarius' foundation, is not just a programmatic measure that has an important theological dimension. It creates a safe space, a safe haven, an ark that separates the nuns irreversibly from the sinful world outside. The spiritual wolves may lure outside the monastery, but they cannot reach the nuns as long as the enclosure remains intact. And Caesarius shows time and again that he's deeply worried about this feature of the rule. He conceptualizes nuns' entry into the monastic paradise as joyful and triumphant moment. It's inconceivable for him that any nun would want to leave. So there is no provision for escaping nuns. Within the monastery, and he time and again insists on the monasterium as the place where it happens, the nuns are safe and can establish themselves as a congregatio sancta, as a Rex sancta, or as a nobile sanctum, a holy flock. The major instrument in upholding this safe space is the regula, which he also calls a regula sancta. In great anxiety, he stresses time and again that no one, no nun, abbess, bishop, or any outsider is allowed to change a word of this regula sancta. The original version of his rule, which was later expanded, ends with the following words that express Caesarius' anxiety and the connection between the Sancta Regula and the joyful expectation of salvation. So he writes, I admonish and I charge you before God and the angels, holy and highly venerated mother of the monastery, and you, the prioress of the holy congregation, that no one's threats or persuasions or flattery ever relax your spirit, and do not yourself take away anything from the established form of the holy and spiritual life. I trust, moreover, by the mercy of God, that you will not incur guilt for any negligence, but through your obedience, holy and pleasing to God, will be able happily to attain eternal beatitude. We know Caesarius from another context, which seems to clash fundamentally with this triumphant optimism. He, of all people, was one of the main spokesmen of Augustine's theology of predestination and full dependence on divine grace that denies humans any agency on behalf of their own salvation. Question of grace was a topic of contention, and at the Council of Orleans in 529, so very much in the period when he completed his rule, he formulated a compromise that didn't deny the impact of good works and ascetic achievements on eternal salvation, but strongly emphasized that the ability to perform these good works was a result, not a cause of divine grace. It took actually Caesarius quite a while to come to this point. And we see in his earlier monastic texts, especially in his Regula et Monachos and in an early letter to his nuns, that he conceptualized the monastic space and the monastic community not as a safe haven, but rather as a battleground in which monks and nuns fiercely fought an ascetic battle against vices and temptation. And these texts are actually full of military terminology. So there was a Caesarius before Augustine and the theology of grace and predestination. All of that is gone in the serene enclosed space created with his Sancta Regula. So how did Caesarius, the defender of Augustine, reconcile with Caesarius, the builder of a safe haven and an escape of the trappings of the world? Somehow they had to fit together. After all, three actually of the subscribers of the rule were also supporters of Caesarius in these conflicts about Augustine's theology. So not only he himself, but seemingly they as well, did not see much of a contradiction that we would tend to see there. Caesarius tried to resolve this problem with a somewhat shaky theological construction. He repeatedly claimed that the entire endeavor, him founding the monastery and him giving the Sancta Regula, happened inspired and supported by God. The regula he received from God becomes a salvific instrument. Caesarius' rule, Caesarius' rule starts with these words. Caesarius, bishop, to our holy and highly venerated sisters in Christ, established in the monastery which by the inspiration and help of God we have founded. Because the Lord in his mercy has deigned to inspire and aid us to found a monastery for you, we have set down spiritual and holy counsel for you as to how you shall live in the monastery according to the prescriptions of the ancient fathers, that with the help of God, you may be able to keep them as you abide unceasingly in your monastery cell, implore by assiduous prayer the visitation of the Son of God, so that afterwards you can say with confidence, we have found him whom our soul has sought. Making himself a self-proclaimed sinner, a sort of agent of divine grace, is a bit of shaky construction, but it was emphatically picked up by two of the subscribers of the Regula ad Virgines, who shortly after Caesarius' death and commissioned by the nuns of his foundation, wrote a Vita of Caesarius that makes exactly this point, that Caesarius was a receiver of divine grace and capable of multiplying and transmitting it, especially to his community of nuns, for whom he built a new version of Noah's Ark. And I have here two quotations from the Vita Caesariae. Grace plays in the Vita Caesariae a role more prominent than in any other early hagiographic texts I know, including the Vita Antoni and the Vita Martini. And I would cautiously argue that a byproduct of Caesarius' endeavor is the creation of a new type of saint who does not just perform miracles and acts as intercessor, but who is also capable of transmitting grace. The act of founding becomes in itself a manifestation of divine grace. Consequently, most foundation stories of monasteries are presented as saints' lives. So that's just an idea that came up when I was writing this paper. So that's something really to be sorted out. Now, the next rule, the rule of Bishop Aurelianus of Arles. Aurelianus was the second successor of Caesarius. He ruled as bishop only from 546 to 551 under the new firmly established Frankish rule. Only about a decade after the completion of Caesarius' Regula ad Virgines, he wrote a new monastic rule whose 53 chapters selected, rearranged, and rephrased parts of Caesarius' Regula ad Virgines and also his Regula ad Monachos. Now, please don't be blind now. To give you an impression about the topics addressed in this rule, I just put the list of the chapters on this slide. So you don't have to read through all of them while I'm talking. It's just to for those of you who are not really familiar with monastic rules, just to see what's basically in there. Aurelianus' rule is preserved in two versions, one for monks and a shorter one for nuns. And at least the rule for monks was written for a monastery founded in collaboration with the Frankish King Childebert. So one of the first royal, so it's one of the first royal monasteries. This in itself is remarkable because Aurelianus' contribution to the monastic experiment is a monastic program that is, with a few variations that actually don't touch the core of it, applicable to both genders. So why did Aurelianus decide to write this new rule based on Caesarius' texts instead of just using them directly? Where did he deviate from Caesarius' program? The first reason may have been that Caesarius' Regula ad Virgines was a pioneering text, chaotic and redundant because of its various extensions and alteration, and full of anxiety that his foundation, which was controversial on various levels, would fail. Aurelianus was in a different situation. He profited from the fact that Caesarius had already set a precedent and created a model that could be tweaked and adjusted without having to legitimate its existence. So he could start from scratch with a set of precepts that were short and to the point without very much of reflection. Nevertheless, Aurelianus had its own program that was distinct from Caesarius, which, however, manifested itself only in the prologue, in a handful of side remarks, and mostly in Aurelianus' language. Similar to Caesarius, Aurelianus presents himself in his role as monastic founder and author of a monastic rule as the procurer of divine grace. So in comparison to Caesarius, somewhat tuned down and more formulaic. What he does happens, and I have here some examples in the sources, Deo miserante, Deo inspirante, by his ineffabile misericordia, jubente domino, Deo propitio. He also calls the community several times the Congregatio Sancta, or refers in other ways to their collective holiness. The way how his monks and nuns could achieve this status, however, is much easier than Caesarius had foreseen. He does impose on his monks and nuns not to leave the monastery for the rest of their life, but otherwise space and boundaries play much less a role, both in their spiritual meaning and as an organizational challenge. Caesarius' enclosure is no salvific instrument anymore. The monasterium is no safe haven. A monastic conversion is also no joyful escape to a safe place anymore. Taking enclosure out of the equation may have been another reason for Aurelianus to produce this new rule. Instead of enforcing enclosure, Aurelianus shifts the focus even more to the regula, which he also repeatedly calls a sancta regula. Aurelianus required submission to the regula in the very first and in the last chapter of the rule. It is, as it were, the alpha and omega of monastic life. In his prologue, he states clearly, and therefore we have established for you a rule, an instruction which will prepare you to proceed straightly on the way of perfection and to arrive happily at the kingdom of heavens. He concludes his rule with the words, "This is the end. I, Aurelianus, the sinner, have installed this as our rule in the name of Christ." Another aspect Caesarius added was tuning the abbot quite consistently into a sanctus abbas or a sancta abbatissa, and giving them a much stronger agency. They appear, usually with the epithet sanctus or sancta, in about half of the chapters of Aurelianus' rule, much more often than in Caesarius. So the holiness of the community relies on both submission to the regula and the good guidance of the sanctus abbas or sancta abbatissa, who is him or herself bound to the regula. Consequently, Aurelianus emphasizes the abbot's responsibility before God to adhere to the rule and the necessity to obey the abbot who takes responsibility before God. Another aspect where Caesarius and Aurelianus differ from each other is the place of the liturgical ordo, the ordo psalendi within the rule. Caesarius simply states that the nuns have to follow the order of Lerins and lists rather random-looking liturgical provisions at the end of the rule. Aurelianus' rule contains a full ordo psalendi that is about a third of the entire text and more detailed than that of the Regula Benedicti. And it's, by the way, exactly the same ordo psalendi in his male and in his female rule. We can assume thus that singing correctly is also part of establishing a congregatio sancta, or that, reversely, the community is a congregatio sancta while and through their liturgical activity. Aurelianus expresses this in the following words. During prayer, your holy souls should strive not to wander with your mind, but they should not dare to work or to speak, but you should pray wisely. And the prophet says, I have prayed and I have understood. And this sentence, I have prayed with my spirit and I have also prayed with my mind. You should fear this. Cursed is the man who does the work of the Lord carelessly. So far, Aurelianus' rather simple take on the question of creating Aurelianus' rather simple take on the question of creating a holy community and creating the concept of a holy community. The Sancta Regula, submission to a Sanctus Abbas, and adhering in a well-disciplined manner to an Ordo Psalendi. So now the third one, the Regula Tanatensis, and what I'm going to tell you now is really sort of work of the last couple of days when I put together this paper. The third contribution, yes, here it is. The third contribution to the 6th century monastic experiment is the Regula Tanatensis, a rule of about the same length, written by an anonymous author for a monastery now unknown. He assumed that the rule was written in the 6th century because its author extensively used Caesarius' Regula ad Virgines, the Regula Patrum Secunda, which may have been written for Lerin, and the Latin translation of the Regula Pachomii, which was also available in southern Gaul. The rule's main sources were, however, the Praeceptum and the Ordo Monasterii, 2 sets of monastic norms that were probably written by Augustine. The procedure of composing this rule is in itself interesting. The author picks and chooses from a variety of authoritative texts from the past and inflicts discrete alterations and rearrangements that essentially produce a new program using the weight and authority of the old texts. The Regula Tanatensis addresses largely the same topics as the other monastic rules. So at first sight, it seems that there is nothing special about it. Yet, none of the framings that we find in Caesarius and Aurelianus' rules plays a role in the Regula Tanatensis. There's no sacred and salvific enclosed space with impenetrable boundaries. The monks in the Monasterium Tanatensis can to a certain extent roam around outside, and they have to, because agricultural work performed by the monks themselves is the backbone of the community. The author does not refer to a Regula Sancta, and the term Congregatio Sancta used by Caesarius and Aurelianus is also missing, despite the fact that Caesarius' Regula ad Virgines belongs to the most important sources for the text. Nevertheless, the Regula Tanatensis develops its very own notion of a sanctification, if we want to call it like that, of the community. Both the individual monk and the community that lives together in concord is in line with 1 Corinthians 3:16 and 1 Corinthians 6:19, a temple of God. God is effectively the owner of the entire monastic household, and he dwells in it. In this Domus Domini, monks play a particular role, that of slaves, servi famuli. Being a monk means to serve in order to please the Lord. And I would not take this as purely formulaic, especially since this notion of the monk as servus is absent in all the other rules I presented here. Those monks coming from a rich background humble themselves through voluntary servitude. Those who were poor or indeed a slave themselves just became slaves of a new dominus. They should absolutely not assume that entering the monastery means to step up. The Regula Tanatensis repeatedly requires its monks to humble themselves and to express submission, because God has promised to give his grace to those who are humble. A typical sentence based on this framing concerns the provisor, the steward of the monastery. And I see if I have that here. Yeah. If a steward is negligent in preserving the things that are entrusted to him by the slaves, family of God, he harms God as one of the father states, and when he squanders these goods, he shall give account to the Lord. One key principle of this Domus Domini is the notion of permanent fear of the Lord. And it's actually not so much the fear of damnation. This fear should guide all the monks' slaves' acts and behavior. God is the master who constantly keeps watch over them. So a typical sentence And therefore, a holy man should fear to displease God when he desires to show himself as a faithful slave. A key sentence. These are the things appropriate to be observed by those who have been placed in the monastery out of love and fear of God. Since you are brought together in one place out of the fear of the Lord, it's suitable that you live in concord in the house of the Lord, and you should have one soul and one heart, being watchful in the fear of the Lord. And here I show you how the author of the Regula Tanatensis skillfully inscribed this notion of fear and the notion of the monastery of as the house of the Lord into his source, Augustine's Preceptum. The system of serving leads in the Regula Tanatensis to a strict hierarchy. A monk who enters needs to first to understand whom he should serve. The monastery is divided in juniors and seniors, a division that doesn't seem to be related to age, because a senior has full permission to give orders and permissions to a junior, playing the role that is in other rules, especially in the rules of Aurelianus, assigned to the abbot, who in the Regula Tanatensis actually plays a significantly less role, though he has the right to punish a senior. So it seems that seniors and juniors are really two distinct groups. It's even possible that the Monasterium Tanatensis mirrored the outside world by assigning those who came from poverty the work that they also should have done outside the monastery as well. The author refers to fratres laborantes, which might be not just the ones who happen to go out to the fields, but a distinct group in the monastery that is assigned to do farm work. Consistently with the idea of monks as slaves, the Regula Tanatensis requires that fugitive monks are focused back into the monastery and severely punishes monks who facilitate a brother's escape by not reporting his plans immediately to a superior. So now, I move on to the last experimental 6th century monastic rule, which was written by Bishop Feriolus of Uzès for his own foundation at the shrine dedicated to the martyr Feriolus. We would expect to find a community serving a martyr, which may have simplified the question of collective holiness, but that's not what the Monasterium Feriolacense, as it is called, was about. If we look at the monastic program of the Regula Ferioli, we get the same result. And actually, I have here a list of the provisions. And now I have to find my, the repertoire of provisions of this rule is not very different from that of the other rules. Aside from the fact that Feriolus focuses on a number of details we don't find anywhere else, such as the abbots doing kitchen service once a year, or the prohibition of the monks to hunt. So that's so much about the monastery, but the monks as slaves, which is certainly not present in the Regula Ferioli. So both the program of the Regula Ferioli and the way it is written is completely different from all the previous rules. So there is no Sancta Regula, no enclosed space, no community that defines itself over its liturgical discipline and an ordo salendi. And the monks for which Feriolus founded his monastery were certainly not slaves. There is no servus or famulus around. Feriolus is concerned that they don't wear perfume and don't have too fancy shoes. Of all the 4 rules, the Regula Ferioli is the longest, even though it contains only 39 chapters. The reason of this length is that about half of the text consists of biblical quotations. Only a handful of chapters on the most mundane issues are not supported by chains of biblical quotations. And the overwhelming majority of these quotations comes from the letters of Paul, followed by precepts given by Christ in the Gospels. The Psalms, which are prominent in most other rules, play a minor role there. The model for Ferriol's community is thus the Vita Apostolica, who follows the precepts of the Apostle Paul, who is explicitly referred to in no less than 30 of the 39 chapters, is definitively on the good side. Ferriol's assignment basically exists in distilling a monastic guideline out of the Paulinic precepts. So, to conclude this section, we have 4 monastic regulae written in the span of 3 generations and roughly at the same time as the Regula Benedicti, and 3 of them preserved only thanks to the collective efforts of the 9th century monastic reformer Benedict of Fagnano. All three of them look fairly similar if we look at the topics and provisions addressed. So each of them is composed in a different way, showing that there was at that time no established way of composing a rule. Most importantly, they give entirely different answers to the question, what makes a holy community? The separation from the world, the submission to a regula, the self-definition as slaves in the house of the Lord, or the imitations of the apostle. All of these texts were intertextually tied, and we can assume that the newer ones were written as reactions to the older ones and as contributions to a discussion of what monastic life was all about. Now at the end, I think I still may do that. Now at the end, a quick glance at 2 monastic models that probably, like most monasteries, tried to establish themselves as congregatio sancta without submitting themselves to a regula. Hagiographic texts were just as much used as instruments to construct collective sanctity, and against our expectation, hardly any of them take the simple shortcut of assigning all the agency to a saint and making the community just be players. Hagiographic responses to collectivizing sanctity were just as diverse, and sorting them out is actually one of my next projects. I've looked at a couple of later texts, particularly Jonas of Bobbio's Vita Colombani and Walafrid Strabo's Vita Galli, and I could talk about them in the discussion, but here I want to briefly focus on 2 6th century texts, the Vita Patrum Aconensium and the Vita Patrum Jurensium. One of the most impactful monastic foundations of the 6th century was Submaristagon, which was founded, or rather reformed, in the year 515. Agon was at this point already a popular martyr shrine of the Roman general Mauritius and his Theban legion. In order to safeguard the conversion of the Burgundian rulers to Catholicism, the Bishop Maximus of Geneva struck a deal with the Burgundian Prince Sigismund to transform this martyr shrine into a monastery that would perform ceaseless prayer for the benefit of the kingdom and for the royal family. So they basically turned the Roman martyr shrine into a new spiritual center of a post-Roman barbarian kingdom. And the Vita Patrum Aconensium writes, thus it would be that these same martyrs would be his protectors, and he would possess both the kingdom and the integrity of the kingdom most securely, on the condition that his thought should not deviate from the piety and the way of justice, since the saints protect those who do not wander from the ranks of the good. The task to organize this refoundation was given to a Burgundian courtier and later abbot who had the telling name Hymnemodus, who removed the mixed crowd of the people living at Agon in order to replace them with monks and priests that had been attached to several episcopal households. And he did that often against the will of the bishops and abbots to whose community they belonged. The hagiographer writes, and it was decided that the family of God should be located in this place, that is to say, the family of monks who imitate the heavens both day and night by preserving with divine chants. So the role of Submaristagon as a holy community was built upon 3 foundations. First, the presence of the martyrs, who acted as protectors of the king and the kingdom, then on the fact that their service was carried out by a proper familia Dei that consists of professionals, monks and priests who carried the title Sanctus due to due to their clerical position. And thirdly, their day and night prayer, an act that imitates the heaven. So now it's a Congregatio Sancta who grounds its holiness in the ceaseless activity of intercessory prayer. A community around a saint, or in this case, an entire legion of saints, rather than a holy community, but with the extra that their sainthood is mixed with the sainthood ex officio of holy monks and priests who come there as liturgical professionals and dedicate their lives to uninterrupted prayer. My second example is my favorite saint's life, the Vita Regula of the Jura Fathers, which was written around the same time as the Vita Abbatum Aconensium, and as I would argue, as a response and refutation of the Agon model. The text was commissioned by a monk and a hermit of Submaristagon, maybe two monks who were about to be replaced by the proper Familia Dei of liturgical professionals. The Vita Patrum Jurensium describes programmatically the transformation of a hermitage founded by the brothers Romanus and Lupicinus into a thriving and stable network of monasteries in the Jura Mountains and beyond, headed by their pupil Eugendus. It is thus both a program for the creation of a monastic institution and a study on how to act effectively as a leader of a monastic community. Romanus, Lupicinus, and Eugendus are depicted as three entirely different, yet in their specific circumstances, highly effective abbots. All three parts consist of rather randomly arranged anecdotes chosen to illustrate these 2 points: how to organize a community and how to be a good leader, though in quite a number of these anecdotes, the abbots themselves are absent or moved to the background. So it's really about the community. In one of the most telling stories, Romanus, the first abbot, prays with a group of lepers who realized the next morning that they were healed. As a result, he gets kidnapped by an entire city population who want to use him doing his healing magic. Instead, they get the thundering speech of Romanus about conversion, making clear that he had nothing to do with the healing of the lepers. It was their piety and prayer that cleansed them. Afterwards, he withdraws as quickly as possible to the monastery. So, and I think this is just more than a humilitas topos. In another miracle, Romanus heals a monk who is possessed by a terrible demon. The monk, an elder, wants to convince Romanus to become more selective and to remove all the unworthy deadbeat from the monastery. So it's totally clear that a demon speaks through him. And Romanus casts him out by making a perfectly rational theological argument. The life of Lupicinus contains also a section dedicated to his miracles. The first one consists of praying with 2 monks who want to leave the community and convincing them to stay. Miracle. The second one, which is actually my favorite, consists of healing a crippled old monk through physiotherapy, massage and stretching exercises, a new diet and fresh air. Later on, the bed of this crippled monk, not the bed of Lupicinus, becomes a place of healing. Each of the lives of Romanus, Lupicinus, and Eugendus tells how the abbots teach the community to heal the sick people who were flocking to the monastery. About Romanus, the hagiographer writes, he did not shine all one at this monastery through these wondrous abilities of his. The example of his perfection and charity were such that all the brothers in their wondrous deeds followed the model that he offered to everyone. Thus, one often saw there the venom of serpents extracted on hordes of demons driven out of many people. On Eugendus, he writes, nor was the Blessed Father the only one in the community who had the possessions of the charismatic gifts of good works, but priests too, and many brothers there so that jealous desires might cease, and the man of God would delegate to them this ministry, or rather than keeping it for himself. Somehow the sentence was messed up, probably just by copy pasting it from the PDF. The saints are teachers, moral examples, and act as primus inter pares among a community that is empowered through its conversion, ascetic life, and obedience to the teaching of the abbots. So I would even argue that the patres of the Vita Patrum Murentium are not the abbots, but that all the monks of the Jura monasteries are the Jura fathers. The life of the Jura fathers makes three important points that completely sets them apart from the Vita Abbatum Arcaniensium. First, it's a community of lay people in which priests are welcome only if they submit themselves to the same regime. Everyone is welcome except for those imported liturgical professionals that had set up the new agon. Second, communal prayer may exist, but it's not the central part of monastic life. Thirdly, the collective sanctity of the community manifests itself not in intercessory prayer for kings, but in charitable work for the Christian community at large. And most importantly, one does not need individual saints or martyrs to create a holy community. Romanus, Lupicinus, and Eugendius are just teachers, organizers, and facilitators, but in principle, they are not holier than the rest of the community. Okay, so far my overview over a very, very small segment of sources written in Southern Gaul within just a couple of decades. So there's much, much more around. The complexity, playfulness, and creativity has hopefully helped me to sink the slow and boring monastic ship and to show you something about the fun of reading the textual witnesses of the early medieval monastic experiment against the grain. And that's where I stop and hope I'm curious about your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Albrecht. I think you can safely unshare your screen at the moment, and we'll reshare it if it becomes appropriate. And
okay.
Everyone who's able, I encourage you to open your camera if it works for you in your situation. So I think we're now opening to questions, comments, and there are no ignorant comments or ignorant questions in the sense. Feel free to ask questions from the other end of the Middle Ages or whatever. I think that's, it's good rather than bad, and sometimes it comes up with really interesting questions.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna start with just a super open question, kind of just to sort of to establish a bit of the landscape. Can you give us a sense of how you've talked a number of different points about enclosure for women and kind of men out in the fields. Can you give us a sense of in this period, how much for each gender, how much are we moving towards a closed community as an ideal, or is this really, is the idea of the enclosed community still quite rare?
I think it's there are two sides to it. There's indeed sort of the total enclosure that Caesarius propagates for his nuns, and that was, I would guess, was not something realistic to be emulated for a long time, even though we know that this ideal was upheld in the monastery of Arles. But he also, I think he had an afterlife, and had an effect in the sense that later monastic texts, not so much the four I discussed, but certainly texts in the context of Jonas of Bobbio, and probably even moving into the Carolingian period, were continuing playing with the spiritual meaning of monastic boundaries and of the monastic space, and the sort of the salvific effect of monastic boundaries. This is something that's a legacy of Caesarius that was picked up and transformed, and as it were, as a piece built into new systems of monastic discipline. So if we look, most of the book I wrote, The Pursuit of Salvation, deals with this regula cuiusdam ad virgines, which to a large extent tries to repair the shortcomings of Caesarius' enclosure as safe space idea, but integrates it into a much broader system of monastic discipline. So in that sense, it goes on. How it was practically implemented, that's of course another question, but unfortunately a question we can give only very tentative answers out of bits and pieces we have in hagiographic texts. So I can't help very much with that, but sort of I think Caesarius played actually much more than, for example, the rule of Benedict, a role in sort of the spatial side of medieval monastic discipline.
So, I mean, do you think it's fair to say that that Caesarius and the Rule for Virgins kind of becomes a sort of imaginative laboratory for thinking about the question of the monastery as a supercharged space? Yes, I think it is. And I mean, we saw right from the beginning that Caesarius may have developed these ideas with women as guinea pigs, but this text was read and used immediately. I mean, if we already look at Aurelianus of Al, immediately for both genders. And that's actually not only the case with his monastic rule, but also with that letter I mentioned briefly, this letter Verio, which also was probably already in Caesarius' lifetime turned into a sermon for monks. Okay, thank you. That's so interesting. Coming into the chat now, we've got a question from Alice. Alice, do you want to turn your mic on?
Thanks. Thank you, Albrecht. It was really, really interesting. And it just really struck me looking at your sort of breakdown of just how different these rules are, just how easy it is to miss, strangely, the level of difference in what they fundamentally thought monasticism was about. And at the same time, that they share so many aspects. I mean, they have sort of the similar, so there are things that they take to be really central that appear to us to be kind of, in a way, tropes, or not that easy to notice because it's so common, like being slaves of God, or having fear of God. And then I wonder, is it just because they have this common pool of available things monasticism could be about, but then they pick radically different assemblages? Or what do you think those is it a process of selection and they just go off in different directions, but they have at heart kind of a sort of common available pool? Or do you think that the available pool is retrospective because we're used to seeing those traits in so many texts later?
I mean, the problem is, of course, that we don't know how many of these texts are lost. But I mean, if I look at the way how, for example, someone like the author of the Regula Tranatensis worked and how he used, but then also fundamentally changed Augustine's works, then I would cautiously say that there are trendsetters, and that there is, with this concern about how to turn the monastic community into a holy community, that this was something that becomes important in the 6th century, and that we really have fairly original attempts to resolve this question. But as I said, they're all intertextually linked, and what becomes one standpoint, one theory, one approach to it, the apostolic community, the community of monastic slaves, that gets into a pool of options and gets an afterlife, and is reshuffled and combined in later texts. And coming back to the Regula Cuiusdem ad Virgines, mid-7th century, there we have actually about all of that, all of these models we find for the first time in the 6th century, combined to one, again, in itself, very original program of monastic discipline. So it's a, I think, and you, if any one of you says, well, I found early examples, then I'll be happy to hear them. But I think that really we can see these texts as documents of monastic ideal inventing itself.
Thank you. That's fantastic. Lawrence, do you want to ask your questions, or do you prefer me to read it?
I'll unmute. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm happy to ask the question. I was struck by being an architectural historian about the reference to the door linking the Caesarean community with the basilica, and that the nuns should not go through that. I just wondered whether Professor Diem could comment on that linkage. Is the location immediately next to the basilica a way of emphasizing episcopal control, just can you comment on that location and the door linking the nuns to the basilica?
I can try it, even though I probably Conrad has probably much more profound things to say about it. Now I'm calling on people which I should not. But what fascinates me that that the basilica seems to be a place belonging to the monastery, but also belonging to the outside world. And if I'm not mistaken, the basilica is actually also the place where the nuns, once they're dead, they can sort of move into the basilica and they're buried there and get now safe and now in paradise, can be sort of returned to the community at large. So it seems in any case that the liturgical activities, the nuns had their own space within the monastery. But it's the fact that it's so closely to the basilica, I guess that it does have a root in the Caesarius' willingness or his desire for proximity, even though he himself did exclude him from the monastic space itself. But this is something, I mean, Conrad, you're much more firm in also the archaeology of Lerins, of Arles and the theories in that regard. But
Conrad, I think if you want to be profound, we're going to break the rules and let you be profound. But if you want to slink away, we'll let you wait until your own question.
Okay, I mean, I'm going to disavow the archaeological knowledge that Albrecht has imputed to me. I think could add that, if I remember rightly, the convent initially is outside the city, and then that seemed to be too vulnerable, and then it's moved inside. So right in this kind of, it is right in the corner of the city wall. So it's this kind of little spot where they're all kind of huddled, but also very visible. In a sense, there's this one door that marks this whole kind of boundary, and it's, I mean, in terms of kind of dramatizing the whole issue, I think there's a theatre to it. But Simon Losley for the archaeology, not Conrad Leiser.
Okay, Rachel, do you want to come in?
Yes, thanks. That was very interesting, thinking about all the kind of experimentation. And then I wanted to ask, seeing some of the rules have these kind of terribly detailed things about food, for example, is there any sense that these writers of these rules are responding to the kind of ecology and environment of the spaces that they're in, because they're in kind of quite different places? Or is this all a kind of theoretical community that sort of could be anywhere from the desert to kind of up a mountain?
No, that's absolutely not the case. There's an experimentation going on two different levels. There is this kind of experimentation of how to conceptualize a community, and kind of a theological experimentation, and the experimentation of how to get around Augustine. But on the other hand, there was, of course, the very practical challenge of how to do it, how to keep the community working. And this was certainly also bound to ecological circumstances. So, for example, the regula tanatensis is the only rule that explicitly mentions that the monks grew wine, and that they went into the vineyards, and that this was part of the agricultural work. Then we have, of course, different regulations on monastic clothing and dresses, and some implying that there were harsh winters, and some implying that there was a much more moderate climate. So certainly on a practical level, we find a lot of ecology in these monastic rules. Regula tanatensis, for example, makes clear that the monastery is probably placed either on an island or at the bank of a river. So you have to cross a river to get into the dangerous zones of the world. So if I think you can use them as a source in that regard, if you just sort of comb through them and see what they offer in terms of hints to landscape and climate. So this was not parts. They were, of course, they were moved around, and of course the rule of Benedict was eventually followed in Scotland, but they were written for a specific climate and for a specific landscape.
Thank you. Becca.
Honestly, can we pass on to other people? Because I'd rather hear other people's questions before mine, because mine is very Burgundian specific, and I'm not sure how many people want that in their lives.
Yeah, no, I think we have to follow the rules. Go for it.
Okay, so I think you'll know this text, so this isn't a really unfair question, but do tell me if I'm wrong, Professor Diem. So, as you know, after Jugendus, you get to Ventiolus, except it really goes into a bit of a disaster. And as far as we know, there's a really awkward letter from Avitus of Vienne, where he essentially seems to describe a problem that the presumed next abbot of Jura, this Ventiolus guy, has actually decided to take his brother's bishopric and leave the community. And the monks don't really seem to be very happy about this. They seem to really be a bit concerned that, no, you're our brother, you're committed to this community. And he's like, nah, but my brother's also the bishop, so I'm going to his community, and it's great. And I wondered if you could say something, I suppose, about whether this model of brotherhood that we seem to get in the Jura monasteries is maybe, creates different tensions and relationships between these monks, including the ability for these monks to leave and become bishops, than what you get in these other models, the rule models you've said, where people are servants of a household and that is their relationship. I don't know if that question makes sense, but do you see where I'm coming from, I suppose? How do these rules deal with monks who become bishops, which is increasingly a thing in Gaul?
There are, this is an object of contention. It happens quite often, and of course, monks are attractive as for becoming clerics and for becoming bishops, simply because of their purity, their ascetic achievements, their knowledge that makes them good candidates. And there was a constant competition and headhunting between monasteries and episcopal sees on the best people, and we see some of that implied in the life of the Jura fathers, but also in other texts, the other way around, in the Vita Abbatum Acarnensium, where the liturgical professionals at the monastery were actually recruited from existing episcopal sees against fear, and from existing monasteries against fierce resistance. We have in many rules, especially in the Regula Ferioli, we have in Acts of Councils, very strong provisions against kind of mobility out of the monastery and mobility between monasteries without the permission of the abbots and without the permission of bishops. So this was probably one of the major reasons of conflicts between monasteries, and it's so seemingly they were really keen on keeping their people and letting them with their skills and knowledge just go away and leave. And there are also, there are several stories in the Vita Patrum Juvensium about monks who want to leave. And certainly the life of the Jura fathers, aside from being that programmatic text that I indicated, it was most likely also written as a response to conflicts arising before and probably also after Jugendus Abbacy. So that's another subtext of the life. But you probably have worked yourself much deeper into that aspect than I did.
I'm not sure about that, but thank you.
Good. Okay, James Miller.
Yes, thank you for a really, really interesting paper. Could I ask a bit about, in particular, again, staying with sort of Burgundian focus, but the Vita Abbatum Acarnensium, and particularly you mentioned the importance of these liturgical professionals, and also the importance of the presence of martyrs. Is there any evidence from any of the stuff what they're doing with the martyrs, if there's any sort of processional chants, any sort of physical behavior with the relics in order to stress the importance of these saints to the community?
Not that I know of, and some other people might correct me, but it is there is an idea of serving at the shrine of a saint or the shrine of a martyr, and there's some role they play in liturgy, but usually for the texts I know, actually rather marginal role. I still have no idea, neither for the Monasterium Feriolacense, nor for the Jura fathers, nor, for example, for St. Gallen, what the service at the shrine of a martyr or saint, aside from practical sides, channeling the pilgrimage, actually entailed, except for maybe reading the Vitae at the Saints' Day. Maybe other people can sort of help me on that, but I'm actually not sure.
Thank you.
Okay, all right. Now for the very profound Conrad Leiser. You have to turn your mic on though, although it's actually, I mean, it's actually quite good to just have your
I'm
mic
still
on.
muted. Okay, now I'm good. All right. Thank you. Yes, thank you, Albrecht, as ever. The devil. Can we talk about the devil?
Oh, my favorite.
Good. I mean, would you be prepared to, I mean, I fully understand and endorse the no big boring ship kind of sailing on, but would you do a big story, if not a big ship, about the devil in this period? And as being the thing that they're always thinking about all of the time.
Oh, this is actually, I'll give you a vague answer, but this is actually one of the homeworks of for the next couple of months. If I look at my set of monastic rules, there's something interesting going on. And one is demons are almost completely absent. I think there's one reference to demons in the Rule of the Master, but there's a reference to everything in the Rule of the Master. The devil is fairly present, but he plays various different rules and has different functions in these monastic programs. In many texts, the devil is either representing the outside world, or representing conflicts within the community. So if the anger and conflicts and violence is quite often identified as being instigated by the devil. If we look at the rule of the regula cuiusdem ad virgines, so this 7th century rule, there the devil is plays a very distinct role, and this is the devil sits on the margins. The devil sits on the various boundaries of that are established in these rules. So the devil sits on the physical boundary, so a little bit like the spiritual wolves in Caesarius, but he sits also at the boundaries of the community, and he also sits or tries to cross the boundary of the individual. So he's a sort of a liminal figure there. And the interesting thing is that this idea of the devil as liminal figure does not appear in the Rule of Benedict, but it does appear in the Rule of the Master. So there's one of the many crazy links between that 7th century text with the Rule of the Master that actually bypass the Rule of Benedict, which might actually shake up the entire Benedict Master narrative, in which I don't believe actually. If you're really interested in the devil, I hope in 2 or 3 months I will be able to send you a text that actually sorts out properly where the devil appears in all these monastic rules. And he does play these very distinct and different roles, and he has a function in at least some of these monastic programs. And with Caesarius, the devil it's the spiritual wolves that are sort of roaming around the monastic enclosure.
Thank you, fantastic. Okay, guys, we're coming up to the hour, so I'm going to be quick and dirty. Rachel is reminding us that one of the things that happens in holy spaces is that you have to keep pilgrims from nicking things, relics, silverware, etc., So that connects, I think, back a couple of questions ago. And then Connor, I think we're going to let you have the last word. Well, the last question, and then Albrecht can have the last word.
This may be a kind of so basic as to be slightly stupid question, and I had screaming children here, so you may have already answered it. But why now? Why here? Why are all these people interested in trying to create a holy community in different ways without any kind of clear model, but are all feeling the same need to do the same thing at this point in time in this cultural milieu?
I think, I mean, I had this shopping list of transformations, and there are, of course, all interrelated to each other. I think it has to do with, yeah, the challenge of Augustine, and there I had to restrict myself to these 4 or 6 examples, but I could have added a couple more. It has to do with that. It certainly has to do with this question of monasteries becoming foundations. So there's an external interest, and these rules are, well, at least 2 of them are written by outsiders who founded their monasteries with the interest that they serve. So it certainly has to do with, yeah, with these 2 aspects, but there's probably also, you can tie them to the other transformations, to the space questions, certainly to the intercessory prayer questions. So, I mean, there's so much happening in this then 6th century. It's just part of that. But this is, admittedly, this is a rather vague answer.
I'd have to say, I think that's a question that it's one of those really great basic questions that actually, you know, it's going to take you the rest of your academic career to answer. So, okay, well, with that, let's take advantage of the lull and thank Albrecht. Now we're allowed to have yellow hands of the clapping type, you know, or noise of any kind. Albrecht, we really appreciate you sharing your research and, you know, so for responding so interestingly to the questions. We look forward to reading your volume. Thank you for making it open access. Everybody, remember, we want the libraries to still order the physical book. And we'll, you know, hope to see you at Leeds, I guess, or some other, you know, shared sacred space of ritual.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me. This was really a treat, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all. Yeah.
Good. Okay. Bye for now, everyone.